It was October 2016. The world felt like it was spinning out of control. Politics, protests, people fighting over what was right and wrong. But for me, none of that mattered. My world stopped because of her. Mihaela Maloyu, an 18-year-old girl whose name I can't forget. No matter how hard I try. I've worked on a lot of cases in my career. Some were tough, some messy, but this one broke me. It wasn't just the crime. It was the way it all unfolded. The way it made me question everything I thought I knew about people, about life. I still see her face. I still hear her name. And I still wonder if we could have done more to save her. This is the story of Mihaela Maloyu, a girl who had her whole life ahead of her. A girl whose tragic murder didn't just reveal the darkest sides of humanity. It left scars on me that I'll carry for the rest of my life. Before I tell you the story, I need you to understand something. Being a police officer isn't just a job. It's a responsibility. People think it's all about catching bad guys and solving crimes, but it's so much more than that. You see the worst of humanity, the things most people don't even want to think about. You're expected to stay strong, to keep going no matter what. You're supposed to be the one who holds it all together when everything else is falling apart. But some cases break you. They don't just haunt your dreams. They change the way you see the world, the way you see yourself. This is one of those cases. This is the story of Mihaela Maloyu, a young Romanian girl trafficked into a life of misery, and the investigation that changed my life forever. Mihaela was just 18 years old. She came from a small town in Romania, the kind of place where life is simple but hard. Her family didn't have much, but they had each other. She was the youngest of 3 siblings, and from what I've learned, she was the dreamer of the family. She wanted more out of life. She wanted to study, to travel, to see the world beyond her little town. She had big dreams, but not many opportunities. Her family struggled to make ends meet. Her father worked odd jobs, and her mother stayed home to take care of the children. They weren't poor, but they weren't comfortable either. Mihaela wanted to help. She wanted to make something of herself so she could give back to her family to make their lives easier. But life wasn't kind to her. She was vulnerable. That's the word we use, isn't it? Vulnerable. It sounds so clinical, so detached. But what it really means is that she was alone. She didn't have anyone to protect her, to guide her, to warn her about the dangers out there. And that's how they got her. She was lured in with promises of a better life. A job in Switzerland, they told her. A chance to make money, to send some back home, to start fresh. She believed them. Why wouldn't she? She was young, hopeful, and desperate for a way out. But the people who made those promises didn't care about her dreams. They didn't care about her at all. They trafficked her into Switzerland, into Lausanne. It's a beautiful city full of life and energy. Tourists come from all over the world to see the sights, to enjoy the culture. But beneath the surface, there's a darkness most people don't see. That's where Mihaela ended up, forced into sex work. I can't even begin to imagine what she went through. The fear, the pain, the hopelessness. She was just a girl, barely an adult, and she was trapped in a nightmare. And then there was Alexander Verger. He was a local security guard, someone people trusted. He worked at a nightclub in Lausanne, the kind of place where people go to forget their problems, to have a good time. But Alexander wasn't there to protect anyone. He was calm, manipulative, and deceptive. The kind of man who could look you in the eye and lie without blinking. From the moment we started investigating, he was our prime suspect. But proving it, that was another story. He was smart, careful. He knew how to cover his tracks, how to make himself look innocent. He had an answer for everything, a way to explain away every piece of evidence we found. But there was something about him, something that didn't sit right with me. I've been a police officer for years. I've dealt with murderers, abusers, and everything in between. And I've learned to trust my instincts. My instincts told me that Alexander Verger was hiding something. And then there's me. I've been doing this job for a long time. I've seen things most people couldn't even imagine. I've dealt with the kind of evil that makes you question everything, your job, your choices, even your faith in humanity. But this case was different. It wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about a girl who had no one else to fight for her. A girl who deserved justice even if it came too late. I still remember the day we found her. It was at the French border in a remote forest. The kind of place that feels like it's been forgotten by the world. The silence was deafening. The air was cold and the trees seemed to close in around us. It felt like the forest itself was mourning her. Her body was found in a shallow grave covered with leaves and dirt. She was so small, so fragile. I'll never forget the look on her face. Even in death, you could see the fear, the pain she must have felt in her final moments. It's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Mihaela was just a girl. She should have been safe. She should have been protected. She should have been dreaming about her future, not fighting to survive. But when she disappeared, no one even noticed. No one except us. And even then, it felt like we were too late. I still think about her. About the life she could have had. About the people who failed her. And about the man who took everything from her. This case didn't just change the way I see my job, it changed the way I see the world. It made me realize how fragile life is, how easily it can be taken away. And it's a story I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. It all began in late 2016 when Mihaela went missing from Lausanne. For 10 days, no one knew where she was. 10 days. That's a long time for someone to just vanish, especially someone like Mihaela. She didn't have a family nearby to report her missing. She didn't have friends who could raise the alarm. She was alone in a foreign country, and when she disappeared, it was like she just slipped through the cracks. For those 10 days, life in Lausanne went on as usual. People walked the streets, went to work, met their friends, and carried on with their lives. But somewhere out there, Mihaela was fighting for hers. And then, on the 11th day, everything changed. Forestry workers in France stumbled upon a horrifying scene. They were clearing a path in a remote woodland area near the French border when they saw something that made them stop in their tracks. At first, they thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a wild boar. But as they got closer, they realized it was a person. A young woman. She was lying there in the middle of the forest, surrounded by leaves and dirt. Her body was savagely beaten and stabbed multiple times. The brutality of the crime was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I've seen my fair share of violence, but this was different. It wasn't just a murder. It was rage. Pure, unfiltered rage. I remember standing there, looking at her lifeless body, and feeling this overwhelming sense of failure. She was so young. She didn't deserve this. No one does. But it wasn't just the violence that got to me, it was the way she was left there, like she didn't matter. Like she was nothing. The forensic team worked tirelessly to gather evidence. They found unknown male DNA inside her and on a bloodstain on her foot. But at that moment, it didn't feel like enough. We didn't know who she was. We didn't know who had done this to her. All we had was a body and a crime scene, and the clock was ticking. The challenges started piling up almost immediately. The case straddled two countries, Switzerland and France, which meant we had to deal with delays, jurisdictional issues, and endless bureaucratic hurdles. Every time we thought we were making progress, we'd hit another wall. It took months to identify her. Months. Can you imagine that? A young woman brutally murdered and no one even knew her name. It was like she didn't exist. We had no immediate leads, no family coming forward to claim her, no missing persons report that matched her description. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. And then finally we caught a break. A woman was walking along a remote path outside Lausanne when she noticed something unusual. It was an ID card lying on the ground near a large bloodstain on the concrete. She picked it up and handed it over to the local police. When we got the call, I remember feeling a flicker of hope. It was the first real lead we'd had in weeks. The ID card belonged to Mihaela Maloya, and when we tested the bloodstain on the concrete, it matched the DNA of the Jane Doe we'd found in the French forest. It was a breakthrough, but it wasn't the end. Knowing her name wasn't enough. We needed to find out who did this to her and why. We started piecing together her last known movements. Phone records placed her at the scene where her ID card was found. It was clear that something had happened there, something violent. But what? And who was responsible? The more we learned about Mihaela, the more heartbreaking her story became. She was just a girl, barely an adult, trying to survive in a world that had been cruel to her. She didn't have much, but she had dreams. She wanted to make something of herself, to build a better life. And someone took that away from her. I couldn't stop thinking about her. About the life she could have had. About the people who failed her. And about the person who did this to her. This wasn't just a case to me, it was personal. I didn't know Mihaela, but I felt like I owed her something. I owed her justice. But justice isn't always easy to find. The evidence we had was fragile, and the trail was growing colder by the day. We knew we were running out of time. Whoever had done this to Mihaela was still out there, walking free, living their life while hers had been stolen. We had her name. We had her DNA. We had a bloodstain and a crime scene. But we didn't have answers. Not yet. And the more we dug, the darker the story became. This was just the beginning. The beginning of a case that would test everything I thought I knew about my job, about people, and about myself. A case that would leave scars I'll carry for the rest of my life. The investigation was anything but straightforward. With 2 countries involved, the process was slow and frustrating. Every day that passed felt like a failure. Every day that Mihaela's killer was still out there felt like we were letting her down. The French authorities were cooperative, but the bureaucracy was a nightmare. Every request for information, every piece of evidence, every lead we wanted to follow had to go through layers of approval. It was like trying to run a race with your legs tied together. But then, a critical piece of evidence emerged. A bloodstain on Mihaela's foot. At first, it seemed like just another detail, but the forensic team believed it could be the key to unlocking the case. The blood wasn't hers. It belonged to someone else. Someone who had been close enough to her during the attack to leave a mark. The theory was that the perpetrator had injured himself during the attack. Maybe it was a struggle, maybe it was an accident, but either way, it was a lead. We started combing through local hospital records, looking for anyone who had sought treatment for a bad cut around the time of the murder. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. I remember sitting in the station, going through page after page of records. It was tedious, mind-numbing work, but we couldn't afford to miss anything. And then, finally, a name stood out: Alexander Verger. He was a local security guard, someone who worked nights at a nightclub in Lausanne. According to the records, he had come into the hospital a day after Mihaela's murder with a badly cut finger. He told the doctors he had injured himself while working on his car. At first glance, it didn't seem like much. People cut themselves all the time. But something about it didn't sit right with me. We started looking into Alexander's background. He was in his late 30s, lived alone, and had no criminal record. On paper, he seemed like an ordinary guy. But the more we dug, the more questions we had. He had a reputation for being quiet, reserved, but also a little off. People who knew him described him as calm, almost too calm. The kind of person who could keep a straight face no matter what. When we brought him in for questioning, I remember watching him walk into the room. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look angry or scared. He just looked blank, like he was completely detached from the situation. We started with the basics, where he was on the night of the murder, what he had been doing, if he knew Mihaela. He denied everything. He said he didn't know her, had never seen her before. He claimed he had been at work that night and had gone straight home afterward. But then we asked him about the cut on his finger. That's when things started to get interesting. He told us he had hit a deer on the motorway and had used his pocket knife to put it out of its misery. He said the cut happened when the knife slipped. At first, it sounded plausible. Accidents happen. But here's the thing. His car only had a single broken headlight. No other damage. If he had hit a deer hard enough to kill it, there should have been more damage to the car. A dented hood, a cracked bumper, something. But there was nothing. Just a broken headlight. It didn't make sense. And the more we pressed him, the more his story started to fall apart. He couldn't remember exactly where the accident had happened. He couldn't explain why there was no blood or fur on his car. And when we asked him why he hadn't reported the accident, he just shrugged and said he didn't think it was necessary. I remember sitting across from him, watching his face as he spoke. He was calm, almost too calm. But there was something in his eyes, something that told me he wasn't being honest. I've been doing this job long enough to know when someone is lying. And Alexander Verger was lying. The pressure to solve the case was weighing heavily on me. Every day that passed felt like a failure. I started losing sleep, replaying the crime scene in my mind over and over again. I couldn't stop thinking about Mihaela, about what she must have gone through in her final moments. I felt guilty, like I had let her down. I knew it wasn't rational. I hadn't even known her when she was alive, but I couldn't shake the feeling. And then when we pressed Alexander further, his story took a bizarre and chilling turn. He started talking about how sometimes people get what they deserve, how the world isn't fair, and how some people are just unlucky. He didn't say it outright, but there was something in the way he spoke, something in his tone that made my skin crawl. I remember walking out of that interrogation room and feeling like I couldn't breathe. I knew we were onto something, but we didn't have enough to hold him. Not yet. We needed more evidence, more proof. And the clock was ticking. This was just the beginning of the investigation. The more we learned about Alexander, the darker the story became. And the closer we got to the truth, the more I realized just how much this case was going to affect my mental health. Alexander told a story that sounded like something out of a crime novel. It was the kind of story that made you stop and think, could this really have happened? He sat there in the interrogation room, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a nervousness in the way he kept glancing at the table, avoiding eye contact. He started by saying he didn't know Mihaela personally, but he had seen her before. He claimed she was one of the girls working the streets in Lausanne, girls who were controlled by dangerous men, pimps who didn't hesitate to use violence to keep them in line. He said he had seen her being beaten one night and couldn't just stand by and do nothing. I stopped to help her, he said. She was crying, begging me to get her out of there. She said they were going to kill her. It was a compelling story, I'll admit. The way he told it, you almost wanted to believe him. He painted himself as the hero, the man who had stepped in to save a young girl from a life of misery. But then his story took a strange turn. He claimed that after he helped Mihaela, she asked him to drive her somewhere safe. He said he agreed, but instead of taking her to a shelter or the police, he drove her to a remote path outside the city. When we asked him why, he hesitated. Then he admitted that she had offered him sex in exchange for his help. I didn't want to, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But she insisted. She said it was the only way she could repay me. It was hard to listen to. The way he tried to justify his actions, to make it seem like he had no choice. But we let him continue. We needed to hear the whole story. He said that while they were parked on the remote path, a black car pulled up behind them. He claimed it was the pimps, the same men who had been beating Mihaela earlier. According to him, they got out of the car and pulled a gun on him. I thought they were going to kill me, he said. They told me to get out of the car, and when I did, they grabbed my knife from the glove compartment. What he said next was even stranger. He claimed the pimps used his knife to kill Mihaela. He said they stabbed her multiple times while he stood there, helpless. I tried to stop them, he said, his voice breaking. But they told me if I didn't help them, they'd kill my family. They made me help them dump her body in the forest. It was a chilling story, but there were holes in it. Big ones. For starters, there was no evidence of a black car at the scene. No tire tracks, no witnesses who had seen anything suspicious. And then there was the knife. It was his knife, the one he carried with him everywhere. If the pimps had used it, why hadn't he reported it stolen? Why hadn't he gone to the police? The more he talked, the more his story started to unravel. He couldn't explain why his DNA was on Mihaela. He said it must have been from when he tried to help her, but the forensic evidence didn't match up. His DNA wasn't just on her clothes, it was inside her. And then there were his phone records. They placed him at the scene where Mihaela's ID card and the bloodstain were found. He had been there, no question about it. But the most damning evidence came from his partner. When we interviewed her, she told us that Alexander had come home late the night Mihaela disappeared. She said he was covered in blood and refused to tell her what had happened. I thought he'd been in a fight, she said. He told me not to ask questions, so I didn't. But he was acting strange, like he was scared of something. It was becoming clear that Alexander wasn't the victim he claimed to be. He wasn't some good Samaritan who had tried to save Mihaela. He was the killer. I wanted to believe him. I really did. I wanted to believe that there was some explanation, some reason why this young girl had ended up dead in a forest. But the evidence didn't lie. As I sat there, listening to him spin his story, I couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and sadness. Anger at him for what he had done, and sadness for Mihaela for the life she had lost. She had trusted him, and he had betrayed her in the worst possible way. We pressed him further, asking him to explain the inconsistencies in his story. Why hadn't he reported the pimps to the police? Why hadn't he come forward sooner? Why was his DNA on her? He didn't have answers. He just kept repeating the same thing over and over again. They made me do it. They made me help them. But we knew the truth. The evidence told a different story. Alexander Verger wasn't a victim. He was a predator. And Mihaela had paid the ultimate price for trusting him. The evidence against Alexander was piling up, and with every new piece, the picture became clearer. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore, it was fact. Alexander Verger wasn't the man he claimed to be. He wasn't a victim. He was the killer. The DNA evidence was the first nail in the coffin. It was undeniable. His DNA was found inside Mihaela, and it wasn't just a trace, it was enough to prove that he had been with her in her final moments. He tried to explain it away, saying it must have been from when he helped her, but the forensic team was certain. The DNA didn't match his story. Then there were the phone records. They placed him at the scene where Mihaela's ID card and the bloodstain were found. He couldn't explain that either. He said he had driven through the area on his way home, but the timing didn't add up. His phone pinged off the same tower for hours, meaning he had stayed in the area far longer than he claimed. And then there was his partner's testimony. She told us that Alexander had come home late the night Mihaela disappeared. He was covered in blood, and when she asked him what had happened, he told her not to ask questions. She said he was acting strange, more nervous than she had ever seen him. I didn't know what to think, she said during her interview. I thought maybe he'd been in a fight or something. But now I think he was hiding something. Her words were damning. They painted a picture of a man who wasn't just lying, he was trying to cover his tracks. But even with all the evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I started questioning myself, wondering if I had overlooked something, if there was a piece of the puzzle I hadn't found yet. The pressure was getting to me. I wasn't sleeping much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mihaela's face. I saw the crime scene, the forest, the blood. I kept replaying the case in my mind, going over every detail, every decision we had made. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about what she must have gone through in her final moments. It started affecting my personal life. I was short-tempered, distracted. My family noticed, but I didn't know how to explain it to them. How do you tell the people you love that you're haunted by a case? That you feel like you failed someone you never even met? But despite the toll it was taking on me, I knew we were getting closer to the truth. Finally, we had enough to arrest Alexander. The DNA, the phone records, his partner's testimony, it was all too much for him to explain away. When we brought him in, he didn't say much. He just sat there, staring at the table, his hands clasped tightly together. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't try to defend himself. It was like he knew it was over. But even with the arrest, I couldn't shake the feeling of doubt. Would the court believe his bizarre story? Would they see through his lies? Or would he somehow manage to walk free? The trial was one of the most intense experiences of my career. It wasn't just about presenting the evidence, it was about making sure Mihaela's voice was heard. She couldn't speak for herself anymore, so it was up to us to tell her story. The courtroom was packed every day. Journalists, members of the public, even Mihaela's family. They were all there, waiting to see if justice would be served. Her family had flown in from Romania. I remember seeing her mother sitting in the front row, clutching a photo of Mihaela. She didn't say much, but the pain in her eyes said everything. The prosecution laid out the case piece by piece. They showed the DNA evidence, the phone records, the testimony from Alexander's partner. They painted a picture of a man who had lured Mihaela into his car, taken her to a remote location, and killed her in a fit of rage. Alexander's defense team tried to argue that he was a victim, that the pimps had forced him to help them. But the evidence didn't support his story. There was no black car, no tire tracks, no witnesses who had seen anything suspicious. And the knife that had been used to kill Mihaela was his. One of the most powerful moments of the trial came when Mihaela's mother took the stand. She spoke about her daughter, about the kind of person she was, about the dreams she had. She talked about how Mihaela had wanted to study, to travel, to make a better life for herself. "She was my baby," she said, her voice breaking. "She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve to die like this." Her words brought the courtroom to tears. Even the judge had to pause for a moment before continuing. When the verdict finally came in, I should have felt relief. Alexander Verger was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Later, on appeal, his sentence was increased to 30 years. But all I felt was emptiness. Justice was served, but it didn't bring Mihaela back. It didn't erase the guilt I felt for not being able to save her. I remember walking out of the courtroom that day, feeling like the weight of the world was on my shoulders. I had done my job. I had helped bring a killer to justice, but it didn't feel like enough. Mihaela's family thanked me. They said they were grateful for everything we had done, but I couldn't look them in the eye. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had failed her. This case changed me. It made me realize how fragile life is, how easily it can be taken away. It made me question everything: my job, my choices, even my faith in humanity. But most of all, it made me think about Mihaela, about the life she could have had, about the dreams she never got to chase, and about the people who failed her, including me. Justice was served, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a reminder of how much work we still have to do to protect the most vulnerable among us. And it's a reminder I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Mihaela's story is a tragic reminder of the horrors of human trafficking and the lives it destroys. She was just 18 years old, with her whole life ahead of her. She should have been in school, laughing with her friends, dreaming about her future. Instead, she was trapped in a nightmare, forced into a life she didn't choose, and ultimately taken from this world in the most brutal way imaginable. Her killer is behind bars now, and for that, I'm grateful. But the truth is, the system failed her long before she met him. It failed her when she was trafficked into Switzerland. It failed her when no one noticed she was missing for 10 days. It failed her when she was left to fend for herself in a world that was far too cruel for someone so young and vulnerable. I think about her often, about the life she could have had, about the people who loved her and the dreams she never got to chase. And I think about the countless others like her, people who are trapped in the same nightmare, who are crying out for help but have no one to hear them. Human trafficking isn't something that happens far away, in places you'll never see. It's happening everywhere, in cities and towns, in places you'd never expect. It's happening to people like Mihaela, young, vulnerable, and desperate for a way out. If there's one thing I've learned from this case, it's that we all have a role to play. If you see something suspicious, someone who looks like they're in trouble, someone who might be a victim, don't stay silent. Report it. You could save a life. It's easy to look the other way, to tell yourself it's not your problem. But Mihaela's story is proof that silence can be deadly. She needed someone to notice her, to step in, to help her before it was too late. We can't bring her back, but we can honor her memory by making sure her story isn't forgotten. By speaking up, by taking action, by refusing to let this happen to anyone else. Mihaela deserved better. They all do. And it's up to us to make sure they get it.
Thanks for watching.
Like and subscribe.